All right, so now we're going to get into object-oriented programming in JavaScript, or OOP. And the way that we write object-oriented code in JavaScript is a little different than some other languages. It can even be a bit controversial, and I'll get more into that later. So I want to talk about what OOP is outside of any language, first of all. So OOP, or object-oriented programming, is a programming paradigm. In short, a programming paradigm is a way of thinking about programming, a way of structuring your code. You could dumb it down to the word style. And there are many different programming paradigms, and certain languages are built for certain paradigms. The most common are procedural, object-oriented, and functional. And you can read more about paradigms all over the internet. So what we've been doing up to this point is mostly procedural programming, although we've definitely used some elements of OOP and even functional programming, because JavaScript is an extremely flexible language and you can do things in many different ways, which can be a good thing because you get a lot of freedom, but it can also be a bad thing because it can get really confusing. You don't know what to use for what. Also, it can cause you to sometimes write code that isn't that great. In procedural programming, we just write functions that perform actions. We call those functions to perform those actions. So very straightforward. In object-oriented programming, we write objects that contain both data and functions or methods, and we interact with those objects to perform actions. Okay, some languages actually force you to write all of your code within objects. But like I said, JavaScript is very, very flexible. So let's talk a little bit about what an object actually is. So an object is a self-contained piece of code and is a collection of properties. And a property is an association between a name or a key and a value. And a property value can also be a function, in which case that property is known as a method. So essentially an object is a collection of properties and methods. And objects are used as building blocks and can interact with one another. Now, we've already had quite a bit of experience with objects, such as the built-in math object, the date object. In fact, just about everything in JavaScript can be looked at as an object. It has properties and methods. Even primitive data types like strings and numbers, they're not technically objects, they're primitives, but they're treated like objects when we use certain methods, like let's say we have a string and we use the toUpperCase method. As I stated earlier in the course, what happens is JavaScript will actually create a temporary object behind the scenes, and that's called a wrapper object. Okay, so JavaScript has many ways to create objects, including literals, which we've been using, right? We've used object literals quite a few times, but we haven't added any methods onto them or anything. We've just basically used them as data containers for key value pairs, which is fine. That's usually what object literals are used for. But we do have other ways to create basically blueprints to create multiple objects rather than literals, which is just used for a single object. Now, if you're still a little confused on what an object could be or what could be an object, I just have some random examples here. So basically, any entity in your application could be an object. For example, if you're building a blog, you're probably going to have a post object, a comments object, users, things like that. You may even have UI objects. You might have a class called UI and use that to put things into the DOM, remove things, change things, etc. Products, orders, cart, customer, these are all things you'd see in like an e-commerce shop. Employee objects, messages, books, items. So these are just some very simple examples of what you might see objects created for. All right, so there's a lot of reasons to use OOP for certain projects, but the main reason is that it makes your code easier to understand and easier to maintain. It helps prevent what we call spaghetti code. OOP is also very flexible and can be used to build some really complex applications. It's also very easy to reuse code in OOP, which is one of the reasons why it's so popular. Now, where object-oriented programming really shines and makes sense is when you're building a complex application and you'll need multiple instances of different objects. It's also helpful if you're working on a team. If you're building a relatively simple application, you probably shouldn't reach for OOP. I would say for the stuff that we've done up to this point, I would not use it. And when I say that I wouldn't use OOP, I mean that I wouldn't create custom classes or constructor functions or anything like that. In JavaScript, we're always using objects, so we're always using some aspect of OOP. So that's where it can get a little, there's a gray area and it can get a little weird. So to go over some of the components of object-oriented programming, some of the things that we'll be working with a lot, we've already looked at object literals, which are a way to create a single object. We're going to start to learn about constructor functions, also called constructors, and this is a way that we can create a blueprint to create objects from. So if we create like, excuse me, let's say a user constructor function, we'll be able to create users from that. We also have prototypes, which are a way to for objects to inherit properties and methods from one another. Classes, which are another way to create a blueprint. Classes are syntactic sugar, so what we're actually doing under the hood is creating constructor functions and prototypes. Classes is just a cleaner, easier way to do that. And it's important to mention that a lot of other languages include classes as a core part of the language. Some of these include C#, C++, PHP, and many others. Java, of course. So we also have instances. So basically, when we create a blueprint, whether it's from a constructor function or from a class, and then we create an object based off that blueprint, we're creating an instance of that object. And it's called, when we create a new object, it's called instantiated. Okay, we're instantiating a new object, and we do this using the new keyword, which we've actually seen before when using the date object, for instance. Now I'm going to show you just a very simple class, and the goal here isn't to teach you class syntax. We're going to get into that later, but just to show you kind of how this works. And I'm using a class instead of a constructor function here and in the next video, just because classes are easier to understand. They're easier if you don't know how to do this yet. It's easier to see what this means. It's a class of user. The user has a name and an email. So those are the properties. And then we also have methods like create, profile, and logout. All right, so the class alone is just a blueprint. It's useless in our code if we don't use it. So you can think of it as like a blueprint for a house. The blueprint is just a piece of paper. It's not the actual house. So this is not the actual object. And then we have to use that blueprint to build the house, just like we have to use this blueprint to build a user object. So to do that, we instantiate a user from the class. So here I'm creating a variable. I'm using the new keyword, which is going to instantiate a new user object. So obviously this has to match whatever the class name is. And then I'm passing in a couple values, which are the name and the email. Those are going to go into the constructor of the class, which I'll get into later. Don't worry about that right now. So I can create that user. Then I went ahead and created another user with a different name and email, and then another user with a different name and email. So I'm creating multiple instances from this class. Now, we've used object literals quite a bit. That's where you just need one single simple object. You use a class or a constructor function to construct multiple instances. And then any of these instances, any of these users can use the create profile method or whatever methods we have available in the class, and we can call that using dot notation. All right, so don't worry about the syntax. I just want you to understand that we have a blueprint and we can create objects from that blueprint, or I should say we can create instances of objects from that blueprint. Now, there's 4 very important principles that are used in object-oriented programming, and we're going to talk about those in the next video.